Hi.
Mhm.
Push got it.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Fort Wayne Museum of Art panel discussion on the life and work of William S. Dutterer. I am Suzanne Slick. I'm the Fort Wayne Museum of Art Collections Information Specialist and curator of the exhibit William S. Dutterer, Below the Surface of Deep Sea. Our panelists tonight are Robert Stackhouse, who is a widely exhibited sculptor, painter, and printmaker. He taught at the Corcoran College of Art, where he ran their BFA program. He has held endowed chairs at the University of Denver, Hartford Art School, the Lamar Dodd School of Art at the University of Georgia. He is also an old friend of Bill Dutterer's. Collections holding Mr. Stackhouse's work include the Museum of Modern Art, the National Gallery in Washington, the Phillips Collection, the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, and the Fort Wayne Museum of Art. Brian Miller is a Baltimore native, owner and director of Catalyst Contemporary, a contemporary art gallery in Baltimore City, Maryland, founded in 2019. He graduated from NYU's Tisch School of the Arts with a BFA in photography, a double major in cultural anthropology. In 2003, he was awarded a master's in economics and social anthropology from the University of Manchester, UK. He is also president of Fine Arts Baltimore, which produces the Baltimore Fine Art Print Fair. In 21, Catalyst took an intense interest in the Dutterer Trust and began representing the late artist's work. Caitlin Tucker Melvin is a curator and exhibition producer whose practice is rooted in accessibility and building deep audience connections. She has held various roles from museum education to exhibition management at MassMoCA, Creative Time, the Walters Art Museum, the Williams College Museum of Art, among others. She holds an MFA in curatorial practice from the Maryland Institute College of Art, Baltimore, and a BFA in curatorial studies from Moore College of Art and Design, Philadelphia. Her introduction to the work of William S. Dutterer was through her MFA thesis exhibition, which was a collaborative effort with Jamie Johnson Dutterer and the ICA Baltimore. And our panel moderator tonight is Lauren Novotny, who is the owner and founder of Parkside Art Group, a fine arts service group founded in 2022, based out of New York and Savannah. She holds a Master of Art Business from Sotheby's Art Institute, New York, and a dual Bachelor of Arts degree in Art History and Economics from Lafayette College, Pennsylvania. Lauren became the collections manager of the William S. Dutterer Trust earlier this year, continuing the development and preservation of Dutterer's legacy. So with that, I will turn it over to Lauren and the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne, for the lovely introduction.
Yeah, well, all the reading, thanks for putting up with that. I didn't memorize the sheet.
Well, and I want to also thank the Fort Wayne Museum, first and foremost, for this comprehensive and concise exhibition, and second, for the platform to have a discussion around William Dutterer's life, practice, and artwork. Lastly, I'd like to extend my gratitude to the William S. Dutterer Trust and Jamie Johnson, Bill's wife and widow, for bringing me on board as a collections manager and introducing me to Bill's work. So I'd like to begin our discussion with an excerpt from Stephen Westfall's essay, Under the Surface, published in 2019 in the monograph William S. Dutterer. What does it mean to be an artist's artist? Which was the sobriquet that followed William S. Dutterer, Bill, to everyone that knew him, around like a vow of poverty. The term is never applied to artists who are enjoying commercial success at the moment. William de Kooning was an artist before he was successful, particularly when he wasn't showing. Success didn't necessarily mean that artists would lose respect among their peers, but simply that they had ascended to a larger realm of acceptance that included financial reward, which was still a long time coming. Dutterer had his moment of notoriety in the late 60s and early 70s with some of the finest minimalist paintings ever made. And then in true artist fashion, he seemed to turn his back on them in stages. Within a fairly short time, his painting took a nearly 180-degree turn of direction towards personal narrative with a funky cartoonish imagery. Upon scrutiny, that imagery reveals tremendous tactile resonance and virtuoso drawing skills, and tells a story about an artist's search for depth or the depths, that place in art which meets the psyche and frees it. The point was made at the outset of his career. Dutterer's searching trajectory was unencumbered by his early success, which he let go of like a stage of a launching rocket. I thought that was particularly interesting given the title of today's discussion and the museum exhibition. So while cataloging and digesting Bill's artwork and career output for myself, some of the most colorful and helpful resources have been his journals and notebooks. Tonight, our presentation pairs works from the museum show with passages from those very same journals and notebooks, in hopes that both our discussion and some of the artist's own words help us see a little deeper. So Caitlin, if you would start our presentation, we'll go from there. Next slide. So the show begins with Dutterer's light and surface studies, along with his masterful minimalist painting, number 4, which we'll see 2 slides later. And looking at the light and surface studies, the studies represent an extensive and exceptional devotion to planning. We see him thinking about color and light and the environment in which his works will exist and be seen, as this first series out of the Maryland Institute College of Art MFA program. How do we think this series and work sets him up for his journey? I'd love to open this to anyone.
Go ahead. I was going to say, I'd be happy to just throw out a quick thought. I've been thinking about this question a lot. In some way, and I'll say this at the risk of it being diminutive in some way, but it's almost like this work was like, he was destined to do this like postgraduate work where, for years in school, you're being hounded about everything. You have to think through everything, little thing. You just mentioned this idea of him planning. And I see that. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but just when you said it, so much of his work over his lifetime seemed to be very planned in a way, and he'd worked through so many different iterations and using similar symbols, and it was all planning for final pieces or final ideas. And so I was thinking about this image a couple of weeks ago when it was sent over as one of the pieces that was going up, and I'm thinking about this postgraduate artist Bill coming out and having to think through all the minutia of constructing things. And that's how I felt like this piece was coming together in a way, these incremental steps towards something. And just thinking about that made something that I hadn't thought about in his work make sense to me.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'd love to flip to the next slide. Similar to that first slide, where we see these planning steps, we see a work, right, that he has now pulled together as a singular piece. I'd love to get someone's take on, this next step in the planning process. We see his mind at work.
Well, I can say, am I on?
You're on.
I can say that when Bill left the Maryland Institute and came to the Corcoran Gallery of Art, he came into the middle of a kind of a worldwide movement called the Washington Color School, which was really emphasizing formalist ideas about imagery. And what he was developing at the Institute has sort of morphed into what he was doing in Washington, D.C. I mean, using a piece of graph paper as a structure for doing this. He was a massive drawer. He just drew all the time. He couldn't keep his fingers still. I mean, he used to get. I remember he got complaints at a co-op meeting that he was drawing instead of paying attention to the co-op, and he said, "This is how I think." So this is really his. As Brian said, he's coming out of graduate school. We're a little different coming out of graduate school. We had all this stimulus and we had a world of art that we were emerging into that wasn't quite as protected as a university art program. So coming into Washington, D.C., where there were world famous artists producing a lot of fairly formal kind of work, and he started reacting to that in a way. He never became a Washington color painter. He never got into that, although color became part of his concerns about things. But I think he was trying to keep his head above water in coming into this environment of really quite progressive and involved artists. And the Corcoran School of Art was the epicenter of the Washington color movement. So we taught alongside all of these people that you would read about, Sam Gilliam and Gene Davis and those people, Ken Nolan. And so, you know, it's his thing is gray, is it to blue, is it green, no eventable color changing as the light source changes as you change your physical position. These painters would mix their paint for months ahead of the time that they made their paintings. So there's a sense of change and there's a sense of adventure in Bill's approach to his work.
I think too, I wonder how much of it is practical coming out of school and figuring out how to have a practice that is entirely outside of that system. And he's also building his own way of his practice of how to try variations on a theme, how to figure out the thing. And I feel like with these two, he's also following the material and the size, even in these, it's kind of increasing, giving him more space to experiment with as he's figuring out these new things about color. But I feel like with these, he's definitely showing himself how to follow something, the color, the material, out into whatever his practice will be in the rest of the world.
Absolutely. I'd love to flip to the next slide, Caitlin, to your point.
Yeah, this is especially what made me think of it. It's like suddenly it's bigger and it's a little bit more of something, and all of the stuff before was helping him understand where he was trying to get to a little bit.
Yeah, and Robert, to your point about color and that last quote, and we think about, you know, an environment, right? He's finally created a space where perhaps color isn't the only, color has become a vehicle for the person in the space, right? So, or a vehicle for the time of day. For me, I'd love to, you know, get your thoughts on that, because the gray here feels very neutral, yes, but it also feels, you know, like a surface to create on for a person in the space.
Well, in this particular image, it's looking blue. It's where gray turns blue. But a lot of this is a product of his method of painting. I mean, I watched him do this. He would gesso part of a canvas, like he would gesso the border, or he would gesso the inner rectangle, and he would leave the rest of the canvas raw, and then he would paint over it, and then the paint would react differently over the gessoed paint as to over the ungessoed paint, so canvas. So the same color out of a jar, or however he mixed it, would react differently according to how he prepared the canvas. I think he got a lot of that from his explorations of things. And I think when you look at this particular painting, you can't think of, look at it without thinking, wow, that's a mirror. But that's not what he was really interested in. To him at this time, a painting is a thing, not an illusion. And it's an object. It's paint and stuff. And really, one of the largest pieces he ever did was, you have it in the show there, called Light on Light, I believe it is. It's an installation at the DuPont Center. It's a room that's dissected by Mylar, and he's got it lit underneath. And it's a really incredible environment to be in. I mean, because it was light, it shimmered, you saw through it, you didn't, you reflected, and it was a marvelous piece. And I remember the last time I saw Sam Gilliam, we were one of the Washington artists, and we were talking a little bit about Bill Dutterer, and he said, do you think you're ever going to be able to reconstruct that piece? Because that was one of the most magnificent things that was shown in Washington at the time. So he got a lot of creds from some of the other people around him. But this particular painting is something that I really knew him as developing his strong sense. And I believe this carries itself through to the other paintings, even the figurative paintings.
Robert, can I ask a question of you related to that? Just curious in terms of, I mean, you had a lot of experience, not just with Bill, but in teaching and seeing students leave school. Do you feel like the academy in some way, and specifically in Bill's case, had left such a mark on them that when students go, or like when Bill's leaving and working on these new works on his own, that they're somehow tethered to all this stuff that has been pushed on them in school? And I'm just curious if you saw that a lot, or were people like, when people leave school, do they break free? Because I think it gives us an insight into the direction that he is moving in.
Well, I think the purpose of an art school in many cases is to give somebody a toolbox, and then you do what you want with it once you leave school. And that was sort of our philosophy at the Corcoran in the BFA program that we both taught in. And we didn't teach disciplines; we taught process. And so he really, and as far as an artist out of graduate school, I mean, I struggled when I came out of graduate. I couldn't find what I was going to do or who I was or whatever it was. Bill seemed to come into the Corcoran pretty solid on what he was doing. He immediately hooked up with some other artists that were hard-edged and formal. So I think he hit the ground running out of graduate school. So however they prepared him, I don't know. He talked finally of Grace Hardigan, but I don't see Grace Hardigan in this particular painting yet. No. But he gained so much information from her, and I think it was more about process and things like that. So I think watching students come leave an art institution, some of them jump off a cliff, some of them can walk right into a situation. It really depends on the individual. Bill was very straightforward in being able to hit the ground, as I said, running.
And what's so interesting, we have this incredibly formalist painting, back to that quote or the excerpt from Westfall's essay. This is the moment when he's at the peak of his production, so to say, the way, the art world wants to contextualize, or the art market might want to contextualize that. And then, next he abandons it, right? So if we go to the next slide, we move into the cut and folded series. And, he essentially abandons those minimalist works. And these are quite minimalist as well, but, he's changing direction. So we see, not only a compositional change, but an aesthetic change in direction that guides the rest of his career. And each series dives deeper into the question of what it means to really see artwork, and through artwork and oneself, perhaps. And as critical art participants, we're always at risk of overreading things. But here in his cut and folded series, Bill starts out very literally. And I love this image particularly because it brings us back to that first study, right? Where we kind of see him thinking about, cutting into the canvas, moving one flap aside, moving the second flap aside. It feels very progressive.
Yeah, and to some of the comments we've already talked about, in just terms of like, what was Bill really working on that was his under the surface? I was kind of interested in what Robert was saying about how students leave and whether they're tethered or not, because I was wondering about that previous piece, and was that really Bill? Like, I was looking at that work and I was just thinking, how much of Bill was that? And I was thinking about this piece, and when I had some notes written down last week when I first was thinking about these questions and the pieces, and I just wrote down, this is the art in Bill, rather than the art that Bill was making prior to that. And I feel like when I look at this piece, you can see his feud, like you can all of a sudden retrospectively start connecting a lot of things together in terms of the thought processes and even stylistic undertones to the work in terms of efficiency through minimal motion.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the next work, we kind of see that in total, right? And I love this journal entry so much. In discussion with Jamie, for her, Bill's reference, the center in this quote is very literal. He at the time was working on large canvases that were 6 by 10 feet, and he was essentially pushing pigment from the center of the canvas to the edges of the canvases prior to cutting them. And this is a very different scale, but if we're thinking about the exhibition's title and the theme of seeing deep, do we think there's really another layer to this center reference?
I like this question a lot, and I was thinking about it earlier, and just thinking about it. I don't know if I feel like it's exactly a reference to the self, but from the place that he was at making it, the sort of mental, physical, emotional locus of his own response to the material and the experiments that he was making. And it seems like he's always seeking that kind of thing in the work of not even a final form of what the work could be, but a closest understanding of what the material could do.
Yeah.
Well, if you were to visit his studio at almost any time, there was so much work that was unfinished, that was unresolved, that was going somewhere, there was going to be something, that he was somebody that just worked all the time. And he probably, I've looked at these, I've always thought about these particular paintings as kind of an attitude about the formalism of the Washington Color School, in that he's showing us the backside of it as well as the front side. And so the painting is still a thing, but it has another side to it. Sort of it's almost physical in its form, and I think he's just really spending his studio time in developing things, and he sort of goes where it goes. I mean, we were in a program that taught that kind of thing. We taught, let it go where you're going to go. Shake a tree, an apple tree, and you get a bunch of apples falling down. But if a typewriter falls down, pick up the typewriter and work with it, because you didn't expect that. And so he was always, I think, very prolific with his ideas and his sketches and his drawings and his doodles and his, just his general life. I think a lot of these are Bill Dutterer being Bill Dutterer. I think Brian said that a little earlier, that these are Bill Dutterer paintings.
I think something that's interesting. I mean, Robert, you had a more personal, close, physical relationship with the artist, and in Baltimore, we have Caitlin to thank for introducing his work I'm sort of at the tail end of a lot of this and discovering a lot of things about Bill. But the one thing that has always stuck out to me is the depth, so to say, of his psychological involvement in his work. And so when I read this little journal excerpt in terms of like the center, capital C center, I just immediately felt that this is Bill digging deep and trying to figure out what painting really meant to him. I don't know if that's too deep or too literal, or maybe it's too obvious, but I feel like that is something that he is always doing in the work. And if you start, when you read through some of the journal entries, and he wants to know if like he's getting to something, if he's arriving somewhere. And I've felt that way from the moment I was introduced to his work.
Yeah, it feels like an endless, he feels like an eternal student in a way. It's an endless process. And I imagine it's that way for most, if not all artists, but he's constantly digging and constantly pushing himself, process-based, what have you. And what's so wild is, we skip over into Joe Diver. I know we jump over the Word and Image series, but Joe Diver is the next series that we encounter in the museum exhibition on the next slide. And Bill transitions to a fully figurative driven series. And I love this excerpt once again. Speaking about literariness, how do we think the change to a narrative or literariness takes him farther along this path of exploration, going from these very methodical, explorative, also cut and folded works to these, fully sussed out figurative narrative works?
Well, I look at the portrait of Joe Diver, 1982, the print. That's very similar to his first early works. I mean, it's a square within a rectangle, and it's it's something he carries through a lot of his work. And this is 1982. He's already living in New York City. He's living on Broadway, and so he's really there, and he's been there since the mid 70s. So I think the formalism that he had wasn't what he really sensed there. I mean, there was a cacophony in New York City, and the art world was in a real period of change. And even though Bill didn't like the art world, he was aware of it. He saw it. I mean, you can't ignore it when you live in Soho in the middle of all those galleries at that time. And so he sort of went from his more cool kind of abstraction to really paying way more attention to his doodles. I mean, I would walk into a studio and he'd be working on something maybe similar to the Embrace painting, and it might even have been that one. That's a drawing, though, I think. But he had monstrously large paintings of the Joe Diver series. And I'd walk into his studio. He'd buzz me up, and I knew how to get into his door and through the fox lock and stuff like that, and the triple locks. And I'd walk in, and he'd point at it, and he'd start laughing. He just pointed at it and started laughing. So it was a situation that he enjoyed. You look at that. How could he not enjoy doing that drawing? And the meaning of it, embrace. I mean, what is he embracing? I mean, the cacophony of New York City as an ocean. I don't know. I always thought that his Joe Diver series were really some of his best work as a visual artist, in my opinion, because I know I'm jumping ahead on a question here, but I was always envious of him being able to work with oil paint. And he was a master oil painter. And when you look at a lot of his large Joe Diver series, he just really could move that stuff around in ways. And I was in a gallery in New York City with some major oil painting artists, Milton Resnick being one of them, and the way they could just build up the surface with oil. But I think Bill sort of took a lot of his sense of humor. He was a great storyteller. I mean, he told stories all the time. Maybe that's from being in West Virginia. I don't know. But he, at our faculty meetings, he'd always crack us up with these stories about stuff. And so he was incredibly creative in a kind of a literary way, in a literal way. So I wasn't surprised when I first saw these. I thought, of course, it didn't just happen overnight. Like this is 1983 for that particular drawing, but he was there since 1976. So he lived around the corner from me. So
Robert, it's interesting, and Lauren, just to tie that last piece in, which is the folded piece Untitled, that is 10 years before these pieces, really. I mean, I see, and maybe I'm just reading too much, that move from the literal to the literary, embedded in those pieces, in like the folded pieces in the center, these pieces that are moving away from, as Robert said, the sort of more pure formalistic things, that they do have a story in the visual process of, say, that Untitled piece where it's black square with line, piece folded, two pieces folded. There is narrative in that. And of course, narrative and storytelling and, his own personal psychology being shared on the canvas, I feel like started with those pieces, and he's moving when he moved away. And of course, the visual distance between the very minimal things to figures and animals and other more realistic things is huge. But that literariness is embedded in there, because I think that's something that was busting out of him as he's moving away from the academy. And I was kind of asking Robert about that earlier, but again, we're all looking at this hindsight going, oh yeah, these connections moving forward. But I see them as a natural progression. They're a pretty clear progression, and they are connected, obviously through Bill, but things that he was seeing or thinking about or sensing during his art making.
Yeah, I love thinking about, I feel like I can see the New York energy in these works, in the lines. So Robert, I love that connection and, the process, that connection. Brian, to your point about him kind of working through this narrative and seeing a narrative, but now it coming to fruition, so to speak, in a different visual way, is fascinating. And then, Joe Diver disappears and we enter a whole different phase of his work, which is incredible. The Train series and the Gator series. And we know the Gator series precedes the Train series, but the Trains are a very literal reaction to his time spent in upstate New York, recovering from an injury. And like I said, we know the Gators are done at the same time, but they also feel like quite a departure from that train image and motif, particularly as someone who's, just stumbling upon them on a museum wall. And I'm wondering, how do we square these two against each other, given the considerable overlap, yet notable differences? And I think we can have the next two slides to see that. Here we go. So here's the Trains. And if we want to flip to the Gator, and then we can flip back to this.
I think something really interesting to me about the Trains and the Alligators, they're both they're about motion and about sound, especially the Trains. He's trying to capture that sound on paper, but they have the same motion. There's a glide, but they have such different relationships to velocity and power. Like, both of these things could kill you, but one is man-made and one is a creature in our world. And he's kind of using the material in all of these to play with like the sound that comes from them, the ways that they're moving through space and time, and seeing, I think, if he can capture that while he's hearing them, the trains especially. I feel like they are just flips of the same coin almost, in terms of how they're moving through space, and he's kind of thinking about them.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking back to the Folded series. These are two sides of the same issue. One's about noise, and that alligator is not making any noise.
Mm.
It's sneaking up on you, and
Yeah.
I mean, we watched once in the water an alligator sneaking up on a great white heron, and it finally I couldn't stand it anymore. I threw something at it because it was taking about 20 minutes or something like that. But the alligator was just inching so slowly to get that bird. I just couldn't stand it. I shouldn't have done it, but I interfered. But I think they're sort of the same image, and you know they're this thin thing. I think there's something that's interesting about Bill's attitude towards art and the art world, and his use of the diagonal. I mean, especially this alligator right here. It is such a no-no in composition to do something quite like that. I mean, it just becomes kind of awkward in its form, and the train series sort of did the same thing in that you had this thing coming from nowhere to becoming large and bulbous. I think they're connected with his Joe Diver series in that if you look at the octopus embracing Joe Diver, look at all the sound around it, the sound of the ocean, and that sound is what's involved in these particular things. I think he was just enamored by this kind of quasi-formal images that he was able to go back to and play with for a little while that wasn't all round. I mean, this image, if you look at all his other alligator images, I mean, some of them are quite stark, you know, and quite minimal in a way. So I do think that they are about sound or the lack of sound.
It's interesting that in his journal, he thought this was like in some way his the peak of what was going to take him somewhere new. You know, in the last little bit where it says maybe this is where the kid gets his image out of the water and onto terra firma with that body of work, which obviously it wasn't. I mean, his work moved into a distinctly different direction after these. And I've been thinking about these a lot ever since Jamie showed me some of these early on. And I still haven't been able to wrap my head around them because they are distinctly different than, I mean, the transition from Joe Diver series throughout the 80s and late 80s into this work is pretty distinct. Again, you know, transition from folded things and minimalism to very straightforward narrative imagery, and then moving into this is I don't know if compelling is the right word, but it's intriguing because you're moving back. He's moving from these different periods and different kinds of imagery and very, very separate points of reference, I feel like.
Yeah. And it feels like he's kind of just making that change, right? And we know it doesn't happen overnight like that, but the way we see the works and we read the works today, retrospectively, it's almost a little jarring, which is really, you know, we see the gators moving out of the water, and, you know, we're underwater with Joe Diver. So that, you know, helps us transition above, but it's very interesting. They feel minimal to me, but they feel loose also, particularly in this gator print, which is lovely.
Yeah, that again goes to Bill's nature of his work. I mean, you know, it's a monoprint, so he has to work it really fast. And this is, you know, one of many, many things that he had to produce really quickly. But I think he's just really looking at the sense of line, the immediacy of that line that's in this, instead of it being kind of decorative or whatever. It's just really, it's emphasizing water in a very, very strange way, and it's just it's like an urge. And what happens, I think, to artists, especially when they develop a body of work, is that body of work really doesn't ever leave him. Like, he's never left formalism, or he's never left those silver on silver paintings. It's that's a memory in that he has in his studio all the time. So when he's involving himself in different kind of projects, like doing a monoprint, which is painting directly on a plate and then rolling a press over it, or I don't know how he did this, but other than it's a monoprint, it's only one, it's a one-off. So it's very quick, and you just make very quick decisions about it. But it's a quick decision about something he's familiar with and he's done a lot of.
Yeah. I know we're getting tighter on time, so I'd love to flip to his final series. And we have a few slides here for it. So, we really see Bill in this final series of heads abandoning that traditional grounding that we're talking about, right, in this last series with the trains and the gators, and even before that, the Joe Diver series. So we're now removing that foreground, background, sky, air relationship, and we're just taking on the image of a head. And we see many interpretations of that. We have a bit of a clown image on the left, a head that's screaming possibly or yelling on the right. I'd love to flip to the next image. And here we have his notebooks. These, I think, are particularly lovely, where we have clowns. I believe these are mostly from his elevators, or his elevator drawings, where we have him writing notes to tenants. In the background, we can also see him drawing in pattern books. And I love this series. I think everyone really does. But how do we think that this synthesizes his exploration, this dive for him? And do we think they do that? We can also flip to the next slide or two, I think. Here we go.
Well, if anything, starting, with the work of the clown faces, or just the faces in general, the heads, Jamie laughs at me. I called it the early series, the pill heads, just because they're shaped like a long, like a big pill. And she thought that was funny. But they had that shape. I feel like he gets to this period in his life, and he finds a symbol, and he finds a motif that makes complete sense to him. And he uses it in as many different ways as possible. And I love it. I love where this starts and where it takes him, over the next decade in his work. It is a synthesis. I mean, when we're at art fairs or he's showing in the gallery and we're talking about his work, most of the time we're showing the heads, particularly the Sotto Voce series, which you'll get to in a minute. And we talk about how those years thinking about minimalism and thinking about how to be at least efficient in communicating, he finds this way of being extremely efficient in depicting all these various thoughts and using this head form to tell you and to make you feel something in a lot of different ways. Of course, there's the two periods where it's sort of like the clowns and the pill heads, and then they move into the more rounded, very sophisticated, very structured Sotto Voce series. So is it a synthesis? I'm not really sure, but he arrives, for me, he arrives at something when he starts working on these. And he was probably working on them for some time. I mean, some of the journals and the drawing series go back But he fixates or focuses. I'm going to say fixate because he seems to like lock in on something and he does it for a long period of time. And man, he really achieved something in the end with this work.
Yeah, you could argue he takes this series on its own mini journey, right? Starting with that clown and ending up here with these wrapped heads in the Sotto Voce series, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in, but I have such strong feelings about all these. So, I mean, Bill passes away in 2007. So we're left with this as like the ultimate of what he did. We don't know what he would have done. And we can't really think about that because it's just not possible. You just don't know. This is what he left us to really think about in terms of, for me. And it's particularly because there is a synthesis finally in his 50s and his 60s, early 60s, where he finds visual tools that he's using easily to communicate. He's really tapped into himself at this point. He's very tapped into his emotions and psychology. And I feel like he feels free to say what the hell he wants. His work becomes very political and very socially oriented. And he has no qualms about writing words on those things. The first casualty of war is the truth. I mean, you cannot be any more explicit than that. And this is a launching point for the next 5 years of work.
I think about this body of work. I remember when he came back from Afghanistan, and he was really quite taken or shaken actually by what he saw and felt there and was involved with. And I see these as really a whole consensus of everything that he's done up to this point. Absolutely. I mean, you look at these images right here and you go back to that square within a square again. I mean, his formalism is being used now in a different way. I mean, it was cold before and now it's hot. And it's still the same kind of thing. He's got this iconic image that's floating in a space that's not a real space. It's just it's a ground that this image is on, that's contrasting it, that he's using all of his skills in these particular images. I mean, you look at the one that's the wrapped face, and you can see all of his sort of chops as an artist. You can speak about an artist that way. You use your hands to make art and stuff, and it's kind of athleticism. And you look at that, the painting of face, which is just wrapped. You can see the alligator in that. You can see the train in that. You can see some of all the other kind of things in that. And he's just pulling it all together. And these happen to be very emotional now and very outwardly emotional. And I think it's just a major culmination of what he has. And he doesn't have to use all of his tricks. He understands how to compress it and get it right to the point. It's really an incredibly successful body of work, are these heads.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Bill's work, while it's so personal and reactionary, is also so universal and relatable. Brian, I feel like I've heard you speak about how there really is just no barrier to entry. It's very literal. What you see is what you see. And, I wonder, he's thinking about the human condition. He's thinking about his art making and his life's practice. And going to the last slide with that quote, which, is dated 78, 79. So, 2 decades prior to this work almost. Can art and painting be sentimental and still be successful? And I think, we see him kind of pulling that together for us here. I love this quote. I think, a lot of people try to wrestle with the two ideas of sentimentality and great art.
Well, he wrestled with it for 20 some years before he arrived at this point, because it's possible that the feelings he was having about like the trains, I saw the trains stuff and the alligator work more sentimental in a sense, like almost looking back, almost more childlike, nostalgic in a way, both visually and then like, what they evoke. But I mean, that's such a hard question to answer. Can it, is painting sentimental? I mean, I think painting is everything that artist dumps on it. And sentimentality is not necessarily bad. It makes us long for things. And in this Sotto Voce series, there is certainly a longing for things. This is all, this series kind of comes after, particularly Sotto Voce is all after the 9/11 attacks, which he witnessed from the studio in Brooklyn. And, that had to have an effect of wishing things were different. And well, now I have a catapult to let me say things that I really want to say about what I've witnessed.
I think too, it's that his skill is married up with, or as closely as it can be, with what he's trying to get out. It's sort of like when you think about how language has such immense limitations, so does the visual language that artists use. But in these, at least, he's bringing those really, really close together. The using all his tools to get across what he's feeling about these things.
It's like his technique finally like it matches the content.
Yeah,
that's what you're saying. I love that idea.
Yeah, it gets like as close as it can, because I love this question, and I think it's kind of funny because I don't know a single artist whose work doesn't have at least some kernel of their emotional, psychosocial, physical experience of the world in it, and that's kind of the whole point, right? And I love what you're saying, Brian, about especially the trains. I feel like they do call back to those childhood memories. They are really sentimental, but that's why they're his. They're about him and his experience of the world, and very literally his experience of trains and how he's translated that. And I think here we see him making really masterful translation with the heads and the tools that he's built over these decades.
I think that's a beautiful way to end our conversation. I'd love to thank everyone. We do have a little question. Someone asked, how is a large painting like number 4 relating to his other works? They see a correlation to even the figurative works. So we're thinking about number 4, that first light and surface example of a large scale painting. If anyone wants to jump in before we.
So how is it related to the large Joe Diver paintings and things like that? I think he sort of talks about it. I mean, he says one place about trying to find the center. I don't know whether he's really doing that, but they become, they're doorways, they're windows, they're portals, and even though that painting is a thing, it really, as a viewer, you do see it. I mean, I mentioned it's sort of mirror-like, and there are very large mirrors, and but the large-scale paintings sort of create a place. And he talks about place, especially early on, about how color changes when you see it at a different place. So they become an environment. Large scale is an environment. Anytime you approach a really large painting, you go to Europe and you see those massive 20-foot by 40-foot oil paintings of scenes of Venice and stuff like that. I mean, you just go, wow. And so a lot of artists get really really like large stuff. And there was one photograph, he had a large manta ray that he was working on. I don't think he ever finished that painting though, but it's just, sometimes you just got to do something really big that's a place that's like the rest of the world. It's the rest of the known world instead of something that you can hold in your hand or in your lap. So I think as a painter, that is something that happens from time to time. So that's how that painting has a great relationship to the Big Joe Diver paintings.
Yeah.
I don't know if I answered that for the person or not.
No, I think you did that was fantastic. I think it's a human scale, right? So, you feel, as a viewer, you feel yourself in that work, whether you're there or whether there's an image of a figure there or not.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, Robert, Brian, Caitlin, Suzanne, it has been lovely chatting with you tonight. Thank you again, Fort Wayne Museum of Art. Thank you again, Jamie Johnson. And I hope everyone has an opportunity to see the show.
Well, thank you, everybody,
Thank
for this. And thank you, Bill Dutterer, for visiting us.
Yeah.